Shabbat shalom. Context. Context is key. This is one of those universal truths that applies throughout so many of our experiences as human beings. Conversations, arguments, they go from being nonsense to very reasonable, and sometimes back again with the appropriate context. Characterization in media and literature requires context in order to convince us that the twists and turns of a narrative make sense and are reasonable. Context is important in language, whether that is the finest points of grammar and conjugation, or, as anyone who has ever studied a second language will tell you, contextual clues in an unfamiliar place is the only thing that will help you work past and decode a sentence when a word is unfamiliar. And yet, so often, in our Jewish spaces, texts and teachings are presented entirely without context. An iconic phrase from the Torah, a pithy quote from the prophets, an excellent saying from the Mishnah, a midrash from the Talmud. Perhaps my all-time favorite example of this is the famed quote from the book of Micah 6:8. "You have been told, O mortal man, what is good. What your God Adonai requires of you, only to do justly, to love kindness, and you will walk humbly with your God." It is one of those classic, inspiring passages. It is a justice passage quoted by rabbis and clergy people of all denominations when they preach on social justice. It inspires our community to stand up for what is right in the moment, and it is utterly devoid of its original context. In Micah 6, the prophet is furious, raging against his fellow Israelites. He is passing on God's word to aggressively demand that the Israelites come forth and be judged, that they stop their evil ways, that they cease hypocritical sacrifices, that they abandon idolatry, that they prepare for a consequence of their own making. With context for this passage, we know the Israelites have abandoned justice. We know that the words of Micah are not a rallying cry to do better. They are a sentence of guilt. But, and I will be very fair here, the issue of taking a text out of its context is entirely the fault of our ancient rabbis. The rabbis of the Talmud, in their great scholarly ambitions, in their beautiful intellectual sparring, in their literary creativity, they determined that the best and most convincing arguments that would determine the future of Jewish practice would be the ones that were supported by the best quotations from the text. It is a sign of mastery that a rabbi could quote a text and support whatever point, whatever halachic, legal point they wanted, whatever story, midrashic point they wanted to make with a good quote. And universally, as far as the rules of engagement were concerned, you could take that quote completely out of its original context, as long as it made for a really, really good argument. Context of the Torah becomes secondary, in the rabbinical mind at least, to the great creative effort of keeping Torah alive, of keeping it quotable, of keeping it applicable to everyday life thousands of years after it has first been given. So maybe context isn't so important after all. And I know that may sound a little odd, but this is actually one of the things that I love the most about Judaism. I love that our rabbis played around with the very idea of context, of what it even means. And then I also love their next step. I love what they do with it next. It's something you can only really see when you are engaging in the practice of what is called daf yomi. Daf yomi is the practice of studying one single page of the Talmud every single day, page after page, day after day, until roughly 7 years go by, and you have made it through the entirety of the Talmud. But what doing this, reading the Talmud page by page by page, what it does for you, and it does it remarkably, is that it gives you the context for our great Jewish wisdom and the ideas, the inspiration for the forces that shape what Judaism becomes. And what it gives you is a key to the door that unlocks the internal logic, the internal art, and the internal style of the rabbis. And once you have that key and you can open that door, suddenly Torah appears in everything you learn and everything you do. So perhaps, ironically, by disregarding the original context for Torah, our rabbis actually make it universally applicable to every moment of our lives. Which is to say, when it doesn't matter anymore, when you no longer care that Micah is raging against his own generation, when that's not a relevant part of the quotation, suddenly his beautiful words become a timeless and immortal call to justice that has inspired generations of people across the world. It's an interesting idea. Returning to Daf Yomi, though, to the study of the Talmud day after day, it's one thing to know some of the most famous teachings of the Talmud, some of the great iconic stories, including one that I'm going to present this morning. But it's an entirely different thing to see, how do we get there? What leads us to this moment? What turn of phrase sends the ancient wheels of the rabbis spinning and turning over? You see, the Talmud is a written document that is based on an oral tradition. So its logic, its structure, and its flow follow winding and sometimes not so clear paths. Currently, in the study of Daf Yomi, we are in a section of the Talmud called Gittin, which is all about legal methods of divorce. The way that you can deliver what is called a get, the document that ends a marriage. And since we're talking about divorce, we're going to be talking about money. We're going to be talking about paying off the funds which is promised to a woman when she gets married. Inside of the ketubah, the ancient wedding document, was a promise that this is the amount of money that you will have if the marriage does not work out. But sometimes when marriages don't work out, that money isn't there. Not everyone has those funds, or at least liquid versions of those funds on hand. So now we're going to need to talk about, following that twisted train of logic, right? Well, what kind of things can I legally sell or put a loan on to pay for my divorce? And from there, once we start talking about the things you can sell, we're going to talk about the things you can't sell. And as long as we're in the world of things you can't do, suddenly from nowhere, a 2,000-year-old consumer protection law from the days of the Sicarii, a violent religious sect of Judaism, also known as the Zealots, who in their day were not above stealing or threatening people off of their land. And so there is a law, a 2,000-year-old law that has been put into place that stops you from paying off your divorce by selling the cheap land that you bought from a religious zealot who likely stole it from its rightful owner, or may not have killed him and then said, well, this farm is mine now. All about divorce. We follow the twisted train of logic. We've touched on this idea of zealotry, and all of a sudden, the Talmud delivers us into one of its great iconic stories, the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, the story of why God let Jerusalem be destroyed during the war against the Romans in the year 70 of the Common Era. Context. Context is key. Context in this regard is a little bit like playing 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, but except instead of ending in Footloose, we end with the destruction of the temple on Tisha B'Av. So, Tashma, come and listen. Here is the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Once there was a man, and he held a feast. And he wanted to invite his dear friend, whose name was Kamsa. But his servant accidentally went and invited his most hated enemy, a man named Bar Kamsa. The man arrived at his own feast. He saw his enemy. He approached him. He said, "Why are you here? Leave." And Bar Kamsa replied, "Do not expel me from this feast. Do not embarrass me. Let me pay you for everything I eat and drink tonight." "Nope," replied the man holding the feast. "Absolutely not." Bar Kamsa tries to be reasonable. "Fine, let me pay you then for half the feast. Just don't kick me out." The host once again refuses. Bar Kamsa says, "Fine, I will pay for the entire feast. Just do not shame me." And the host took him by his hand, which is not as nice a thing as it sounds. It's more like he grabbed him by the scruff of his neck, and he threw him out. And Bar Kamsa swore revenge, not only on the host of the party, but against the leadership of the Jewish people, the sages who had been sitting there at the feast, who did not stand up and defend him, who did not stop him from being shamed. He said to himself, "I will go to the Caesar of Rome, and I will tell him that the Jews are planning a revolt against him." And that's exactly what he did. And war broke out between the Romans and the Jews, and Jerusalem was destroyed. As the Talmud explains, Jerusalem's destruction was on account of the shame felt by Bar Kamsa. Now, magic word of the day. There is, as you may have guessed, an important piece of context here, which is all so vital and important for understanding why the rabbis choose to tell this story, why it has become one of the most well-known and quoted in the entirety of the Talmud. And it is because there is a fundamental difference between the two different destructions of Jerusalem. The first, which happens in the days of the Babylonians in 587, and the second at the hands of the Romans in 70. And the difference in this context is idolatry. In 587, the Israelites are bad. The Israelites are worshiping idols. They have abandoned their prophets. They have set up false gods, as we heard in our Haftarah explanation. And God warns them, "Turn your back on these false gods. Come home. Be true to my covenant." And they refuse to listen to the warning, and so destruction and exile become inevitable. That's the first destruction of the temple. But in the days of the Romans, the Jews are very proud of their religion. They are maintaining the temple. And as opposed to being tempted by idolatry or polytheism, they are in fact so deeply invested in Judaism that they have created multiple schisms and sects, and one might even call them heresies, each one accusing the other of not being a good enough Jew. You have the Pharisees, and you have the Sadducees, and you have the Essenes, and you have the Zealots, and you have the Karaites, and many more. So, reason the rabbis, how is it possible that the same fate which befell their ancestors who had been bad, who had turned their backs on God, could also befall a generation that was so dedicated to maintaining the temple? And so they come up with this story. They come up with this story of Kamsa v'Bar Kamsa, a reason for why their world comes to an end. And when it is passed down, at least sometimes when it's passed down, at a glance, it appears that the Talmud is essentially saying God is so upset. God is so upset over the way that Bar Kamsa is treated, even by good people, that God is willing to see society completely destroyed. to see thousands of people murdered, to see the end of Jewish sovereignty for thousands of years, and that God's own home should be burnt to the ground on behalf of this one guy. And when you put it like that, the story doesn't actually seem to make all that much sense. And the reason why the story doesn't make that much sense is because of context. What we don't always tell you is that there is significantly more to this story, and it just never makes the abbreviated telling. There are pages and pages and pages of this story, which talk about how Bar Kamsa set up his treachery, how the sages see it coming but are unwilling to compromise on either their ethical morals or their ritual standards, even though they know it will end in war. There are pages about how good people decide to rescue everyone in Jerusalem, but then warmongering extremists choose violence and confrontation and self-destruction for ideological reasons. There are pages about how families put aside their political differences as the world gets dark, and how the leader of those extremists realizes the terrible mistake he's made, and how his own followers are more of a threat to him now than his enemies ever were. There's a daring rabbi who fakes his own death with the help of double agents. He meets the Caesar of Rome. He gets to ask a boon. And depending on who you ask, he's either too cowardly to ask for Jerusalem's safety, or he's too wise and knows that the Caesar will never grant him that wish, and he has to ask for something else instead. And it even has within it, page after page, vignettes, fantastical revenge fantasies about what happens to those emperors of Rome who destroy Jerusalem and the temple. It is huge and winding, and to even condense it to that one thing I just told you, I still left out huge chunks of the story. 3 times someone resurrects the dead. Several other truly fabulous miracles. A fable on the folly of wealth and when it means nothing when your city is under siege. The actual scenes where the temple is destroyed. And one of the most commonly used pages by the church for thousands of years to justify anti-Semitism. All of that is left on the drafting room floor trying to tell this story. Context. Context is key. Because without it, we have a story that only makes sense when you think about it just a little bit. So why then? Why then is Jerusalem destroyed, according to the Talmud, when we actually have the entirety of the story and all of its context? Well, there are 2 distinct answers that come to mind. The first is this: that the Talmud is trying to teach us that in regard to all great communal tragedies, there are actually plenty of off-ramps if we are only just brave enough and willing to take them. If we are brave enough to see them and we refuse to stay on a road that is leading us to destruction, if we are determined to get off, there are ways to avoid destruction. In this story, both what I shared with you and what I could not, there is a continued thread of people who just refuse to see where their actions are leading them, or who know that there will be consequences, but they don't care. They hear that God is patient. They hear that God is waiting. They hear that God is forgiving, but they don't take God up on the offer. Even after Bar Kamsa is shamed, the moment when you would think to yourself that the Talmud is saying, well, that's it. No. The story keeps going. There are plenty of other opportunities to avoid the tragic end. And that's what makes it a tragedy, is that people are blind to danger, that they're unwilling to change. They're not willing to make active choices to save themselves and their neighbors. Our Talmud tells us that we have the power to avoid tragedy. It is actually within our hands if we are only willing to act with proper intention, action, and conduct before it is too late. And in a very hopeful note, even when you think it's too late, It might not be too late yet. But there's also the second idea. And the second idea is quite the opposite. The second idea says that even with full context, human beings cannot always understand why terrible things happen. We can't accept sometimes why terrible things happen. Suffering erupts into our world despite the goodness of our deeds or the kindness of our hearts. We do not understand why. And so we create a story, a narrative, that helps the world make sense. The rabbis have this creative morality tale. They have their revenge fantasies against their Roman oppressors. They're desperate for a reason why God is letting this happen to them, because it just doesn't seem fair. But a historian has a very clear and easy answer for them. It's one they don't want to hear. Because the easy and simple historical answer is that Rome was the mightiest empire the world had ever seen, and that the tiny kingdom of Judea was just in their way. To quote Dr. Rachel Schneiderman, it is devastating to the rabbis to think that God could be so petty and punitive, but it is less devastating to think that than to imagine that God was unable to stop the Roman army. Two teachings from the same text, two teachings from this same idea in our Talmud, and they all depend on how you choose to look at things, how we choose to see the world around us. The first is, of course, the great optimism. We have the power to change the world if only we act. The second, the world is a big place. It moves beyond us. We are powerless in the face of it. And the greatest challenge of life, of course, is knowing that both of those things can be very true at the exact same time. So let me close this morning by putting it a different way, by giving it back to our rabbis, a teaching of Rabbi Simcha Bunim, who famously taught to us that at all times a person should have two small slips of paper. Put one into each pocket, and on the first one, please write, "For my sake, the very world was created." And onto the other, "I am dust and I am ashes." And the Rebbe's great wisdom, his great teaching, it says, is at each moment of life, figure out which pocket to reach into at which time. Is this a moment where the world is created for your sake and power is within your hands? Or is this a moment to be humble and know that you are no more than dust? You cannot change the world. When should we act with audacity? When can we change the world? And his students reply, well, Rebbe, how do we know when to reach into which pocket? Well, his answer, as they say, is context. Because context is key. Shabbat Shalom.